Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The ion storm howled like a wounded beast across the desolate surface of Crix, tearing sand from the dunes and hurling it through the air in blinding sheets. Gray hunched his broad shoulders against the onslaught, his weathered cloak snapping violently in the wind as he pressed himself against a jagged outcropping of rock. His calloused fingers tightened around the worn grip of his electro-shepherd's staff, the weapon's subtle blue glow barely visible in the storm's fury. But his thoughts were not on the storm. In his mind's eye, he saw the face of Corporal Jenkins, a kid barely 19, with eyes too innocent for war. "Sir, I'm picking up strange vibrations on the perimeter sensors," Jenkins had reported, his young face creased with concern. "Something's moving out there that doesn't match Imperial or Rebel signatures." "It's just interference from the Ridge's mineral deposits, Corporal," Gray had replied, not even looking up from his tactical display. "We've got our orders. The intelligence says minimal resistance. Move your squad into position." "With respect, sir, these readings are unusual. I think we should—" "That's enough, Jenkins. This isn't a debate. Execute the assault as planned." Their neural signatures had winked out one by one on his tactical display. 12 lights extinguished in less than 4 minutes. When the dust settled, Gray found Jenkins' body sprawled against the ridge, half his face gone, the other half still wearing that expression of bewildered trust. Beside him lay a strange sensor device. Not Imperial or Rebel, exactly the kind of anomaly Jenkins had tried to warn him about. That night, Gray had removed his Imperial insignia and walked away. Not just tired, broken. He left with the blood of his soldiers on his hands and the bitter understanding that blind obedience was its own form of cruelty. He hadn't just sent them to their deaths. He had actively silenced the warning that might have saved them. 3 planets, 3 campaigns, 3 graveyards he had helped fill because he never questioned, never refused, never stood up and said no. Gray pressed his forehead against the cold rock, feeling the sting of sand against his face, almost welcoming the pain as a distraction from the memories. The guilt was a constant companion, heavier than any pack he'd ever carried. When the storm's howl momentarily abated, another sound reached him, faint but distinct. A thin, pitiful whimper that sent a jolt of alertness through his battle-hardened body. It wasn't one of his armor bulls. He knew their sounds as intimately as he once knew the rhythm of artillery fire. This was something else. Something inside Gray broke. He couldn't walk away. Not again. Not when something needed help, needed mercy. The mercy he'd failed to show when he sent those kids to die for a few meters of meaningless terrain. The soldier's instinct that he had never quite been able to suppress made him straighten, adjust his grip on his staff, and move toward the sound with cautious, measured steps. Each footfall was placed with deliberate care, his eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced vigilance of someone who had survived when others hadn't. In a shallow gorge carved by ancient waters long since dried up, pressed against a stone as if trying to become part of it, lay a youngling. Its body, no larger than a large dog but densely muscled beneath segmented chitinous armor, trembled visibly. Dark, almost black blood seeped from a jagged wound in its side, pooling on the dusty ground beneath it. As Gray approached, the creature's head snapped up, and 2 eyes like burning coals fixed on him. Intelligence and agony blazing in equal measure. Gray's breath caught in his throat. A Drakai youngling, the apex predators of Crix, a sentient race of warriors who considered all other life forms their rightful prey. Beings whose reputation for cruelty and combat prowess had spread even to the Imperial outposts where Gray had once served. The soldier part of his brain screamed a warning. Kill it now, before it grows up and hunts you down, before it brings its pack. One swift blow and you'll save yourself, and probably countless others a world of pain. But the shepherd he had become, the man who had walked away from orders and uniforms and senseless death, saw only an injured child, shivering from cold and pain in the aftermath of the storm. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his past decisions, Gray lowered his staff. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The youngling snarled in response, baring needle-sharp teeth that gleamed like polished obsidian. Gray slowly reached into his satchel, maintaining eye contact with the creature. "I'm not going to hurt you. Not today." He withdrew a flask of water and a clean strip of cloth. With movements deliberately slow and predictable, he approached the wounded Drakai. The youngling's snarls gradually subsided into a wary, continuous growl as Gray cleaned the wound with gentle efficiency, his fingers remembering field medicine administered to fallen comrades in trenches across the galaxy. "You took quite a hit," Gray observed, tightening the bandage around the youngling's torso. The creature watched him with unblinking intensity, its intelligent eyes tracking his every move. "Something bigger than you, I'd guess. You're lucky to be alive." Gray sat back on his heels, considering his options. The Drakai lair was somewhere in the Rocky Mountains to the north. Everyone on Crix knew that much, though few were foolish enough to venture anywhere near it. Leaving the youngling here meant condemning it to death, either from its wounds or from the nocturnal predators that would soon emerge from their burrows, drawn by the scent of blood. "Damn it all," Gray swore, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "I must have taken one too many blaster shots to the head in my soldiering days." With a grunt of effort, he lifted the surprisingly heavy youngling into his arms. The creature tensed but made no move to bite or struggle. "I hope your parents appreciate the gesture before they decide to eat me," Gray muttered grimly. "Though I suppose there are worse ways to go than being devoured by the most feared predators on Crix. At least it would be a story worth telling." The journey to the mountains was arduous. The ion storm had passed, leaving behind air so cold and clear it seemed to ring like crystal with each breath. The twin moons of Crix rose overhead, casting an eerie bluish light across the landscape. Gray carried the youngling, feeling its small body gradually relax against his chest. At first the youngling had remained tense and wary, a continuous low growl rumbling from its throat. But as the hours passed and Gray's steady pace and body heat provided comfort, the creature's growls subsided. To Gray's surprise, the youngling began to examine him with curious eyes. At one point, it extended a small clawed hand and traced the prominent scar that ran along Gray's forearm. Not scratching, but following the jagged line with an almost gentle touch, as if studying this strange being who had shown it kindness. "Curious little thing, aren't you?" Gray murmured, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like years. The youngling made a soft clicking sound in response, its eyes never leaving his face. By the time they reached the foothills, the youngling had nestled comfortably against Gray's chest, its breathing growing shallower as the hours passed. Gray felt an unexpected pang at the thought of leaving the creature, a connection forming that he hadn't anticipated. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, he saw them, cave openings scattered across the face of the cliff, dark entrances hidden in shadow. The Drakai lair. Gray's mouth went dry, his heart hammering against his ribs with primitive fear. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to drop the youngling and run. But he had come too far to give in to fear now. He approached the largest cave entrance and gently placed the youngling on the ground. To his surprise, the creature made a soft, protesting sound, its small claws reaching out to grip his sleeve as if unwilling to let him go. Gray carefully disengaged the tiny claws. "You're home now," he whispered. "This is where you belong." The youngling made another sound, higher, almost plaintive, that made Gray's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. He patted its armored side once, briefly, then began to back away. He hadn't taken 10 steps when they emerged from the darkness, moving with a silence that defied their size. A dozen Drakai warriors, their massive forms easily twice his height, surrounded him in a fluid, coordinated movement that left no path of escape. Their muscular bodies were covered in the same chitinous armor as the youngling, though theirs bore the scars and decorations of combat. They held bone spears in their four-fingered hands, the weapons pointed unerringly at his vital organs. Gray froze, his hand halfway to the staff at his belt. He knew it would be useless against so many. He had survived 3 planetary campaigns only to die on a forgotten moon because he couldn't leave a wounded child to die. There was a certain irony to it that almost made him smile. But they didn't attack. Instead, to his utter astonishment, the warriors, as one, dropped to a single knee before him, their spears lowered to the ground. Gray blinked, certain he was hallucinating. "What?" he began, but the words died in his throat as 3 more figures emerged from the cave. 2 were warriors, but unlike the others, their armor was adorned with elaborate ritual scars and trophies, bones, teeth, and unidentifiable tokens of battle. They flanked the 3rd figure, a warrior maiden whose presence commanded attention despite her more slender frame. She was taller and leaner than the others, her armor shimmering with a bluish tint that caught the early morning light. Her eyes, the color of molten gold, regarded Gray with such icy contempt that he nearly took a step back. "What's happening?" Gray whispered, but no one answered. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the rocks. Finally, a massive Drakai with a face carved by countless scars stepped forward from between the two adorned warriors. Power radiated from him like heat from sun-baked stone. This, Gray realized with a sinking feeling, must be their leader. Beside him stood the warrior maiden, her posture suggesting a familial connection despite her obvious disdain. An ancient elder, his armor gray with age, approached Gray. When he spoke, his voice was like the grinding of stones, each word seeming to scrape its way out of his throat. "Outsider," he rasped in broken common tongue, clearly learned from rare traders. "You returned the wounded heir to the lair. You have completed the ritual of the shepherd." Gray blinked, uncomprehending. "I don't understand," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I just brought back a wounded child. Our ancient law states, he who risks himself to save the future of the pack proves his heart beats in unison with the clans." The elder continued as if Gray hadn't spoken. "He is worthy to lead us. By returning the heir, you have challenged Chieftain Sarn for the right to lead." Gray's eyes darted to the scarred warrior. "Sarn!" The chieftain's face twisted with barely contained rage, his golden eyes burning with hatred. The warrior maiden beside him, his daughter, Gray realized, measured him with a look of pure venom. "This slug?" she spat, her command of the common tongue surprisingly fluent. "This soft-skinned prey dares to challenge? He is not worthy to clean my armor." "The law is the law, my daughter," Sarn snarled, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very rock beneath their feet. He turned to Gray, looming over him like a storm cloud. "I cannot kill you openly, outsider. The sacred law forbids it, but you must prove you're right. You will face the trials of blood. 3 trials to show your strength. Survive, and we will speak of leadership. Fail, and your bones will bleach in the sun." Gray looked at the predators surrounding him, their alien faces unreadable, their postures tense with anticipation. He had no choice. "I don't want to be your chieftain," he said firmly, meeting Sarn's gaze without flinching. "I'm just a shepherd. I was just doing what anyone would do." "Then die like one," Sarn roared, his voice echoing off the cliff face. "The first trial is at dawn." "Dawn is already here," the warrior maiden observed coldly, her golden eyes fixed on Gray with calculating intensity. "Then prepare the arena," Sarn commanded. "Let us see if this shepherd has the heart of a warrior or merely the stomach of prey." The arena was a natural pit with sheer walls rising 30 feet on all sides, its floor covered in sun-scorched sand, stained dark in places with what Gray could only assume was blood. He was pushed into the center, stripped of all his possessions except for a simple bone knife thrust unceremoniously into his hand. The blade, though primitive, was honed to a wicked edge. The entire clan had gathered on the ledges above, their chitinous forms creating a living wall around the pit. Their collective breath created a low, humming sound that seemed to vibrate through Gray's bones. Shiva, he had learned the warrior maiden's name from the guards who had escorted him, stood beside her father, her face an unreadable mask. Before the gates opened, Shiva descended to the arena floor. The crowd fell silent as she approached Gray, her movements fluid and predatory. In her hand, she held an ornate bone knife, its handle carved with intricate symbols, its blade gleaming in the morning light. "Outsider," she said, her voice carrying across the silent arena. "By our laws, a challenger may select his weapon from the chieftain's arsenal." She held out the ornate knife, then pulled it back as Gray reached for it, replacing it with the crude one he already held. "But for you, this will suffice." It served a young warrior in his first hunt. Her golden eyes glittered with malice. "He died, of course." Gray examined the knife. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed adequate, but his years as a soldier let him spot the flaws immediately. A slightly warped blade, micro fractures along the edge, a handle weighted to throw off his balance. The message was clear. Shiva wanted him not just to lose, but to look pathetic in the process. The first trial tests his courage and combat skill, Sharon announced, his voice carrying easily across the arena. Defeat the beast or be devoured. Either outcome will satisfy our laws. The gate at the far end of the pit rose with a grinding sound, and a monster crawled into the light. Gray's breath caught in his throat. A spiketail, a gigantic scorpion-like creature, its body covered in plates of armor that gleamed dully in the morning sun. Its pincers were the size of Gray himself, and the tail that arched over its back ended in a venomous barb that dripped a viscous green fluid onto the sand. The crowd roared in anticipation, the sound rising to a fever pitch as the spiketail scuttled forward, its multiple eyes fixed on Gray with mindless hunger. But Gray didn't charge. He didn't raise his pathetic knife in a futile gesture of defiance. Instead, he began to move in a circle, his steps measured and calm, his eyes never leaving the creature but taking in every detail of its movement. He was a shepherd. He knew the ways of predators, how they thought, how they moved, how they killed. He saw how the spiketail reacted to sound, how it turned its armored head, leaving its neck vulnerable for a split second. He noted the rhythm of its breathing, the way its weight shifted before it struck. Then he saw it, a subtle vibration, an almost imperceptible tremor in the creature's left pincer just before it lunged. The exact same kind of tremor Jenkins had reported on his sensors before the ambush, the warning sign that Gray had dismissed as interference. Gray's heart clenched in his chest. If he had listened then, if he had paid attention to that tiny detail, how many lives might have been saved? With newfound clarity born of guilt and determination, Gray picked up a flat stone from the arena floor and weighed it in his hand. The spiketail advanced, its pincers clicking in anticipation. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the inevitable slaughter. With a practiced flick of his wrist, Gray threw the stone. It struck the arena wall to the monster's right with a sharp crack. The spiketail instinctively turned toward the sound, exposing the vulnerable joint between its head and torso. In that moment, Gray threw his knife with all the force and precision of a soldier who had survived when others hadn't. The blade sank deep into the joint, black ichor spurting from the wound. The creature shrieked, a high, piercing sound that made the Drakai spectators flinch, and lunged at Gray with blind fury. Gray waited, muscles tensed, calculating distance and timing with the cold precision of a combat veteran. As the spiketail's pincers were about to snap shut on him, he rolled aside, feeling the rush of air as they closed on empty space. The monster, carried by its own momentum and unable to correct its course, crashed headlong into the arena wall. Its tail, with which it had tried to sting Gray during its charge, became deeply embedded in the stone. The spiketail thrashed wildly, trying to free itself, but Gray knew it was effectively immobilized. He approached from the side, avoiding the still dangerous pincers, and calmly severed the tendons in its legs with the knife he retrieved from its neck. The creature's movements grew weaker, its shrieks subsiding to pitiful clicks. Gray stepped back, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. The arena had fallen completely silent. He had won without taking a single scratch, and without using Shiva's sabotage knife, which still rested unused in the sand where he had dropped it before throwing the stone. Gray looked up at the platform where Shiva stood, her golden eyes wide with disbelief. He deliberately walked over to the discarded knife, picked it up, and snapped the blade between his fingers, exposing the hidden faults in the bone. Then he tossed the broken pieces at the base of the platform. The message was clear. Her attempt to humiliate him had failed, and he wanted her to know that he had seen through her ploy from the beginning. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some warriors exchanged glances of grudging respect. Others looked to Shiva, whose face had hardened into a mask of cold fury. But instead of triumph, Gray felt only a hollow ache in his chest. He sank to his knees in the sand, his head bowed, the weight of realization crushing him. If he had been this observant, this attentive to detail when Jenkins had warned him, if he had just listened, his squad might still be alive. The victory felt like ash in his mouth, another reminder of his failure when it had truly mattered. That evening, in the stone cell where they had confined him, Gray sat cross-legged on the floor, using a small whetstone to sharpen the new knife they had given him for the next trial. The rhythmic scrape of stone against bone was soothing, a meditation that calmed his racing thoughts. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. Shiva stood in the doorway, her tall form silhouetted against the torchlight from the corridor. She entered without asking permission, her movements fluid and predatory. "That was luck," she said, her voice cold as the night air outside. Though her tone was dismissive, there was something new in her eyes. Uncertainty where before there had been only contempt. Gray continued sharpening his knife, the repetitive motion unchanged. "Luck is when preparation meets opportunity," he replied, not looking up. "Your monster is predictable. It relies on might, not mind." He paused, then added pointedly, "Just like your attempt to sabotage me with a flawed weapon." Shiva's eyes narrowed. "You think yourself clever, outsider. Yet you walk into our home, claim rights you do not understand, and expect to survive with tricks." "You speak like a coward who fears an honorable fight," she said, but the words lacked their earlier venom. "I speak like someone who survived," Gray retorted. He finally looked up at her, meeting her golden eyes. "My commander also valued honorable combat. He led my squad in a frontal assault on a fortified position. Everyone died but me. Honor is a luxury the dead cannot afford." Shiva stared at him for a long time, a battle of emotions raging in her eyes. Contempt, yes, but also confusion and something new, something different that she seemed unable to name. "The second trial will not be so easy," she said finally. "Many warriors have died in the labyrinth." "Then I'll have to avoid joining them," Gray replied simply. Without another word, Shiva turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Gray resumed sharpening his knife, but his thoughts were no longer on the blade. They were on the strange conflict he had seen in the warrior maiden's eyes, and on what awaited him in the morning. The second trial took place in a subterranean labyrinth beneath the mountains. Gray stood at the entrance, a narrow crack in the rock that descended steeply into darkness. Torches illuminated only the first few feet. Beyond that lay absolute blackness. The assembled Drakai watched silently as Xarn explained the task. "In the heart of the labyrinth dwells a pack of shadow wraiths," the chieftain said, clearly relishing the fear that flickered across Gray's face at the name. "Bring back the head of their alpha, and you will have passed the second trial." "Shadow wraiths?" Gray asked, the unfamiliar term sending a chill down his spine. "They hunt in a pack and can tear a victim to pieces in seconds," Shiva answered from beside her father. This time there was no contempt in her voice, only a cold statement of fact. "They move like living shadows. Many warriors have entered seeking glory. None have returned." Gray nodded once, tightening his grip on his knife. "How will I know the alpha?" "It will be the one that kills you last," Xarn said with a cruel smile. The assembled warriors laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Just as Gray prepared to enter the darkness, Xarn raised his hand. "One more thing," he announced, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "To ensure that our guest follows our sacred traditions, my daughter will accompany him." A murmur of surprise ran through the gathered warriors. Shiva's head snapped toward her father, her golden eyes widening in shock. "Father," she began, but Xarn silenced her with a gesture. "You questioned his victory in the arena," the chieftain said. "Now you can witness his defeat with your own eyes. Or his triumph, if the ancestors truly favor him." His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. "Or perhaps neither of you will return. The clan would mourn, but we would endure." Understanding dawned in Shiva's eyes. This was not about tradition. This was her father eliminating two problems at once: the outsider who threatened his position and the daughter who had begun to question him. She nodded stiffly, taking the ceremonial spear handed to her. "I will ensure the trial is properly observed," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. Gray watched this exchange with wary eyes. When Shiva joined him at the entrance, he simply nodded. "Stay close," he said quietly, "and try not to kill me before the shadow wraiths get a chance." Together they descended into the darkness. He paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Faint phosphorescent fungi provided just enough light to make out the rough contours of the tunnel. Instead of forging ahead blindly, Gray crouched and listened. The labyrinth was not silent. There were sounds, faint but distinct. The soft pad of feet on stone, the occasional click of claw against rock, the barely audible sound of creatures breathing. Gray closed his eyes, focusing on these sounds, building a mental map of the space around him. Again, he did not hunt. Instead, he began to move deliberately, testing the acoustics of the cavern. He threw small stones, creating false signals that echoed through the tunnels. He noted how the pack responded, their movements, their coordination, their hunting patterns. Hours passed as Gray methodically explored the labyrinth, always staying one step ahead of the predators that stalked him. He studied their routes, noting where they left their marks, scratch marks on the walls, the lingering scent of their presence. He began to understand their hierarchy, how they communicated, how they moved as a unit. Most importantly, he understood that the Alpha always moved last, directing the pack from behind, the ultimate strategist. Gray found a narrow passage where the ceiling had partially collapsed, creating a choke point. Here he set his ambush. Using stones and the limited materials at hand, he created a series of triggers that would cause a controlled rock slide. Then he positioned himself and waited. The sound of the pack grew closer. They moved with uncanny coordination, seeming to flow through the darkness like living shadows. Gray caught glimpses of them, sleek, low-slung bodies covered in scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their eyes glowed with an inner fire, and their teeth gleamed like polished daggers. As the pack passed through the narrow passage, Gray remained perfectly still, controlling even his breathing. When the last creature, larger than the others with distinctive scars across its snout, entered the passage, Gray triggered his trap. The rock slide was not large, but it was precisely calculated. Stones crashed down, cutting the Alpha off from the rest of the pack. The creature whirled, its glowing eyes fixing on Gray with primal hatred. The one-on-one fight was short and brutal. In the confined space, the Shadow Wraith's speed and agility were compromised. Gray used the narrow walls to channel the creature's attacks, forcing it to commit to charges that left it vulnerable. His knife found its mark repeatedly, each strike precise and calculated. When it was over, Gray stood breathing heavily, blood, both his and the creature's, dripping from numerous cuts on his arms and torso. But he was alive, and the Alpha's head was clutched in his hand, its eyes now dull and lifeless. The journey back through the labyrinth was tense but uneventful. The remaining Shadow Wraiths, without their leader, had scattered into the deeper recesses of the caves. When Gray emerged from the entrance, Alpha's head in hand, he was met with stunned silence. Even Sarn looked impressed, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. Shiva approached him, her expression unreadable. "You won by cunning again," she said, but there was no accusation in her voice now. "Cunning is also a form of strength," Gray replied, wincing as a healer began to treat the worst of his wounds. "My father taught me that strength is the ability to crush one's enemies," Shiva said, watching the healer's work with clinical interest. "You win by barely fighting. Because the real battle is fought here." Gray tapped his temple with a bloodied finger. "Not here," he gestured to his muscles. In her eyes, he saw a glimmer of something that might have been respect. But there was also confusion, as if she were struggling with concepts that challenged everything she had been taught. "The third trial will be different," she said finally. "My father will not accept another defeat." Gray nodded wearily. "I never wanted any of this," he said quietly. "I just wanted to live in peace with my herd." "Peace," Shiva repeated, as if tasting an unfamiliar word. "Is that what you found, Shepherd? Is that why you walked away from war?" Gray looked at her for a long moment. "I walked away because I was tired of building graveyards," he said finally. "But peace? Number, that's something I'm still looking for." Sarn was furious. The outsider had survived 2 trials, making him look weak before the clan. This could not stand. He himself challenged Gray to the third and final trial, a duel in the arena, warrior against warrior with no tricks or monsters, just raw combat skill. The morning of the third trial dawned clear and cold. The arena was packed beyond capacity, Drakai clinging to the walls and perching on every available surface. This was unprecedented, an outsider challenging for leadership, surviving 2 trials through methods the warriors could barely comprehend. Gray and Sarn met in the center of the arena. The chieftain towered over the human, his massive form rippling with muscle beneath his scarred armor. In his hand, he held a ceremonial spear, its shaft carved from the bone of some enormous creature, its tip gleaming with a metallic sheen that spoke of technologies beyond mere bone crafting. Gray held only his knife, looking small and vulnerable in comparison. But his stance was relaxed, his eyes alert and calculating. He had survived worse odds. "Begin!" the elder called, and Kasarn lunged forward with terrifying speed. His spear whistled through the air, forcing Gray to dodge and retreat. The Chieftain was faster and stronger than Gray could have imagined, each strike coming within a hair's breadth of ending the fight, and Gray's life. The human was forced to use every bit of his combat experience just to stay alive, weaving and rolling across the arena floor. But Gray didn't panic. He watched, he learned, he adapted. He looked for patterns, for weaknesses, for the inevitable mistake that all fighters eventually make. Xarn was powerful, but he was also proud. And pride, Gray knew, was often the deadliest weakness. The fight continued, with Gray taking minor wounds but avoiding any killing blow. The crowd's initial bloodlust began to give way to a grudging respect for the human's resilience. Shiva watched from her place of honor, her golden eyes never leaving the combatants, her expression tense with an emotion she hadn't felt before. Concern for the outsider. Then Xarn made his mistake. Realizing that Gray was too clever, too quick for a simple attack, he took a desperate, blasphemous step. Backing away to the edge of the arena, he blew a ritual horn that hung around his neck, a sacred artifact that sent a visible shudder through the watching Drakai. The great gates of the arena opened again, but it was not a monster that emerged. It was something far more terrifying. The broodmother herself, an ancient primal creature, the progenitor of all predators on Krix, a gigantic blind beast covered in ageless armor that moved by sensing vibrations and the scent of fear. Her massive form filled the gateway, her blind head swinging from side to side as she sensed the presence of so many beings in one place. The Drakai in the stands screamed in terror. This was sacrilege. The broodmother was sacred, untouchable, a living goddess to their kind. Xarn, without hesitation, grabbed one of his own guards and threw him toward the broodmother. The creature, sensing fear and blood, fell upon the unfortunate warrior with terrifying speed, tearing him apart in seconds. "This is your strength, outsider," Xarn roared, charging Gray while he stared at the horror unfolding across the arena. "This is what it means to lead, to use every weapon, to recognize true power." But Gray wasn't staring in horror. He was seeing something else entirely. In the broodmother's blind fury, in her ancient, unthinking rage, he recognized the same mindless destruction that had claimed his squad, that had filled those 3 graveyards across the stars. The war machine that consumed lives without purpose or meaning, the cycle of violence that never ended, that only created more graves, more orphans, more pain. He turned to the platform where Shiva stood, her face pale with shock at her father's actions. "Silence them!" he shouted. "Make everyone fall silent." Something in his voice, a command born of absolute certainty, made her react without thinking. "Silence!" she roared, her voice cutting through the panic. "Be still, all of you!" A hush fell over the arena, broken only by the sounds of the broodmother finishing her grisly meal. Gray threw down his weapon. The clatter of the knife against the stone floor seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He took a step toward the broodmother, then another, and he began to make low, guttural sounds, rhythmic, calming. The same sounds he used to soothe his armor bulls during ion storms. The Drakai watched in disbelief as the human approached the most feared creature on Krix, making sounds no warrior would ever make. Gray radiated no fear, only the calm confidence of a shepherd who understood that even the most dangerous creature responded to certain universal truths. In that moment, Gray wasn't just calming a beast. He was facing his own demons, his own past. The mindless destruction of war, the senseless following of orders that had haunted him, he was confronting it all in the form of this ancient predator. To tame her was to find peace within himself, to prove that another way was possible. The broodmother stopped. Her giant head turned toward him. She was listening. Gray approached and placed a hand on her ancient, scarred carapace. The creature emitted a low, rumbling hum in response, and to the utter astonishment of every Drakai present, slowly bowed her massive head before him. The silence was shattered by Xarn's furious roar. Unable to bear such a defeat, such humiliation, he lunged at Gray from behind, spear raised for a killing blow. "You are just a shepherd," Xarn bellowed, his words directed at the entire clan. "A weak, soft-hearted fool who will make us all prey. He will make you weak like him." His rage-filled eyes searched for his daughter. "He will destroy everything we are, everything we have built." Gray turned to face the charging chieftain, but he did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he stood tall, one hand still resting on the broodmother's ancient carapace. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent arena. "I am a shepherd, not a warrior, and a shepherd protects his flock, all of his flock, not just the strong, not just the ones who can fight." His eyes swept across the assembled Drakai. "A shepherd doesn't sacrifice the weak to feed the wolves. He stands between them." But Shiva moved faster than either man expected. She leapt from the platform and landed between her father and the human, her own spear raised to block his. "No, father," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the arena. "He has made me strong, stronger than I ever was before." Her golden eyes burned with newfound conviction. "My duty is to my clan, to all of my clan, not just the warriors, but the young, the old, the injured, my flock." Her duel with her father was brief but intense. She used everything she had learned from watching Gray. She didn't try to overwhelm him with force. That was a battle she couldn't win. Instead, she used his own rage against him, causing him to overextend, to stumble, to make mistakes that no chieftain should make. When Sarn charged with blind fury, Shiva sidestepped, not retreating as a Drakai warrior would traditionally do, but moving just as she had seen Gray move against the spiked tail, using her opponent's momentum against him. The technique was foreign to her people, but she executed it perfectly. Kasarn, unprepared for this strategy, stumbled past her, and in that moment of vulnerability, she struck. When it was over, Kasarn lay on his back, Shiva's spear at his throat, the tip dimpling the flesh beneath his chin. "Kill me then," he growled. "Take what is yours by right." Shiva looked at him for a long moment, then at Gray, who stood with his hand still resting on the broodmother's carapace. The human gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "No," Shiva said finally, withdrawing her spear. "Death in combat is too honorable an end for one who would risk the entire clan for his pride. A true leader protects, father, even from yourself." Shiva became the new chieftain of the Drakai clan. Her first decree surprised everyone. She did not kill or exile her father. Instead, she sent him to the distant wastelands, to herd armor bulls alongside the human shepherds who eked out a living there. "Let him learn to be a shepherd before he can again call himself a warrior," she told her people. "Let him learn what the outsider knew all along, that true strength lies not in domination, but in understanding." As for Gray, she did not force him to stay, nor did she ask him to leave. She gave him a choice, recognizing that the strongest alliances are those freely chosen. "I have found what I was looking for," he told her, standing at the entrance to the Drakai lair, looking out over the vast, harsh landscape of Krix, quiet, and a purpose. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the Drakai had ever witnessed. The entire clan gathered in the sacred cavern where the elders kept the ancient relics of their people. Shiva stood before them, holding the chieftain's ceremonial spear, a symbol of war and dominance that had been passed from leader to leader since time immemorial. With deliberate movements, she raised the spear above her head, then brought it down across her knee with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the cavern as the sacred weapon broke in two. A collective gasp rose from the assembled warriors. "The clan of Drakai no longer needs warrior chieftains," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "We need shepherds, protectors, those who see strength not in how many they can kill, but in how many they can save." She approached Gray, who stood quietly at the edge of the gathering. In her hands, she held a shepherd's staff, carved from the same material as the broken spear, but with a curved end designed not to impale, but to guide. "From this day," Shiva proclaimed, "you shall be known as the first shepherd of the Drakai, not because you completed our ritual, but because you showed us a better way." Gray accepted the staff, his weathered hands closing around it with familiar ease. The weight of it felt right, more natural than any weapon he had ever carried. In a gesture that stunned the watching clan, Shiva then placed her four-fingered hand directly over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her palm. "The heart of a warrior," she said, her voice clear in the silence, "beats for battle and glory. The heart of a shepherd beats for the safety of the flock." Her golden eyes met his. "You have taught us that the second is the greater strength." Gray placed his own hand over hers, completing the connection. In that moment, they were not alien and human, not chieftain and outsider, but two beings who had found a shared truth that transcended their differences. He became her chief advisor, her tactician, the keeper of the herds, and a teacher to the young warriors. He taught them that wisdom is no less a virtue than strength, and that sometimes, to win, one must understand rather than fight. The partnership of the warrior maiden and the shepherd changed the Drakai clan, transforming them from cruel predators into wise guardians of Crix. Under their leadership, the clan began to trade with the human settlements rather than raid them. They used their strength to protect the weaker species rather than hunt them, and they learned that there was honor and mercy in restraint, in the careful application of force rather than its wanton display. The legend of the human who tamed the broodmother was passed down from generation to generation, a reminder that the greatest strength is not to dominate, but to protect. And on quiet nights when the ion storms raged across the plains, young Drakai would gather around their elders to hear the tale of Grey, the imperial sergeant who became a shepherd, who taught an entire species that the heart of a warrior must also contain the soul of a shepherd.